In this section, we'll explore a couple of inventory models. We're going to look at the very popular economic lot size model. That model basically allows us to determine or answer the question how much to order. This diagram, if you look at it, sort of just depicts the sort of pattern of ordering and consumption. So whenever we place an order and we receive it, we have what we call instantaneous replenishment. Now that's an assumption that for this basic model. The other thing too is that we also have the assumption that the demand rate is constant and there's no uncertainty in this particular situation. So we simply receive the order, we consume it. We receive the order, we consume it, and then the cycle continues. Now at some point when the inventory level drops down low enough, we will actually place the order. We won't place the order at this point unless you have zero lead time. So if you have a lead time, say of one week or 2 weeks or a couple of days, depending on the unit of measurement here, we will place that order earlier. So if we place the order around here and you went up to this point, that inventory level really is your reorder point. Okay, there's the point at which you actually place the order, and then we'll receive the order here and instantaneously take our inventory level back up to the order quantity Q. There's no uncertainty in the lead time or the demand, and so therefore everything is known with certainty. It's a fairly straightforward model, and there's a way to actually compute that decision in terms of how much to order. So demand, we have here's the parameters for this model, is that we would have an annual demand or constant demand rate. We would place an order Q every time we place an order, but every time you place that order you will incur a fixed cost, which we call a setup cost. Then we have an inventory carrying cost, which we call H. Now that would actually take into consideration your opportunity cost, your obsolescence cost, your insurance, your taxes, and all those things. All right. We assume that there's no lead time at this point, which is kind of crazy, but there's usually a lead time, and we could assume that the lead time is constant. And then initial inventory is 0. Planning horizon is basically infinite. So this process just repeats itself over and over and over again. For us to determine the total cost, inventory related costs associated with this, we have two parts. One is really the cost of placing the order, and the second part is the cost of carrying the inventory. So this very first part right here, every time you place an order, there is a cost K that you will incur. But then you carry inventory for each cycle, and the cost of carrying the inventory is really basically your unit carrying costs divided by your average inventory. And your average inventory, if you think about your average inventory as the amount you started with, Q, plus the amount you end with, 0, over 2, then it then becomes Q over 2. And so this formula sort of gives you a sense of the cost that you will incur every cycle. So if we now compute the number of cycles that we will have, what is the cycle time? The cycle time is Q over D, which basically means that if I place an order for, say, 1,000 units, but I use it as 50 units a day, or let's say 100 units a day, then it will last me 10 days. 10 days is my cycle time. I could express that in years, months, weeks, depending on what unit I decide to work with. All right. So essentially, if we multiply this expression by Q over D, each of this by Q over D, then this is what we will get. So this is the cost every cycle. We need to know the number of cycles that we're going to have in a given year. So the number of cycles actually that you will have is D over Q. The cycle time is T equal to Q over D, but the number of cycles that you will have in a year is D over Q. Think about it this way. If my annual demand is 1,000 and I would place an order for 100 at a time, then I'm going to have 10 cycles. All right? And so since this is the cost every cycle, we must multiply it by the number of cycles. But the number of cycles is D over Q, not Q over D. Q over D is the time for each cycle, but the number of cycles is D over Q. So when we multiply each of these expressions by D over Q, we will get this as our total costs. And we could find the value of Q that minimize this by doing differential calculus and end up with this formula right here. I will demonstrate all of that in a work problem in a separate video. Okay, so let's continue. If we look at the parts of this total cost function, we will see that the unit costs per order decreases as we increase our order quantities, but the carrying cost increases linearly as a function of Q, and so therefore the optimum value is somewhere around here. Usually it passes through that center point, not that intersection right here, and we could compute that with the formula that you just saw earlier. Okay, now one of the interesting things about the EOQ, and if I could go back for a second, you will notice that at the point where the minimum occurs, the curve is fairly flat, which means that if I were to go, say, from this point right here to this point, anywhere in that range, there's really not much change in the total cost. But so in other words, I could change the order quantities without a significant change in the total cost, right? So what this table really shows us is that around the optimum point, the total cost is relatively insensitive to the order quantities. And we can see here that if we actually change our order quantity by half or double it, we will have a 25% change in the cost. But look at that. If we actually make change it to 80% of its value, a 20% reduction, the change in cost is only 2.5%, a 10% reduction, 0.5%, and so forth. All right. If you increase it by 50%, then you have an 8.9% increase in the cost. And so what allows us to do then is to be flexible about the amount that we actually order. The optimum order quantity may not be a very nice number. It could be something like 382. Well, we like to round that up to 400, which is a much nicer number. And what you can rest assured is that your cost is not necessarily going to increase dramatically as a result of that. All right. Demand uncertainty usually drives costs up because forecasts are always wrong, and the longer the planning horizon, the worse the forecast. So we try to work with shorter planning periods, but then also too, if you work with aggregate demand data, it tends to be a bit more accurate than if you're trying to work with the individual demand forecast for multiple items. So it's always better to aggregate than to necessarily work with the individual SKUs, because it's a lot harder to predict the demand for the individual SKUs. All right. With these sort of single period models we're going to get into now, this is a very interesting problem, a single period model. And there is another name that it used to be called was the news vendor model. So just to kind of give you a sense of it, this is a case where you have a single period within which you make a decision, and after that period, the process repeats itself, but you really cannot carry the inventory from one period to the next. Okay, so you only have one ordering opportunity. Many situations like that occur in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, airline seats or newspapers, for example. Most people don't buy yesterday's newspaper unless their family has a picture in there. So usually at the end of the day, the newspapers are no good. They take them back to the company and somehow recycled. Okay, we could think of perishable items, hotel rooms as well. Same thing. And so single period models are quite interesting because they usually have some uncertainty associated with them, and we have to make that one decision. And there's a pretty good chance that we could be either with excess inventory or we could actually have a shortage. One of the things that we do know, so if the order quantity is greater than the demand, then you're going to have to dispose of excess inventory. And of course, if it is less, then you lose sales or profit. So what are some of the things that we need to consider in terms of our single period models? Well, we need to know something about the demand pattern. Is there probability distribution associated with the demand pattern? And if you could identify that, that's usually a good starting point. So identify a variety of demand scenarios, determine the probability of each of the scenarios. And then given a specific inventory policy, determine the profit associated with a particular scenario. So for example, what we could do is we could say the range of demands will be between 10,000 and 20,000 units. And perhaps you could use increments of 5,000. So 10, 15, 20, those three are the possibilities. So if you want to use increments of 1,000, then you would go from 10, 11, you'll have 10 possible scenarios. But then you have to associate with each of these scenarios a likelihood, a probability. And that probability allows you to calculate what we call the expected profit associated with a particular policy. And what's the policy? The policy is really your ordering policy. So if we believe demand will somehow vary between 10,000 and 20,000, with a given probability distribution, you could make a decision around, say, ordering 12,000, 14,000, 15,000, 18,000. And of course, if you ordered 18,000, if the demand happens to be less than that, then you essentially have excess stock. But what if the demand turned out to be 19,000 or 20,000? Then you missed out on an opportunity. So we kind of need to do some computation to balance that and determine what is the optimum order quantity that will maximize the expected profit. And so here's what this sort of looks like. If you look at this, you'll see that here's a case, an example used in the text, where we have these likely demands and there's a probability associated with these demands. And to calculate an expected profit, what you need to know is the probability of each of those demands and what the profit that we would gain for a particular combination of demand and order quantity Q. All right? And I've given you a formula here where you could calculate your contribution to profit. So this is just your revenues minus costs, which would be your unit profit, multiplied by however many units you sell. Of course, if your demand is larger than your quantity Q, you will sell Q. But if your demand is smaller than Q, then you can only sell D. That's why this is the minimum of those two. And then this determines if we have any salvage, the maximum of 0 or Q minus D. If you have salvage, then you will get some additional revenues from the salvaging of the excess inventory. And the assumption is that we could salvage everything. And of course, we need to reduce that by the fixed costs associated with, excuse me, the production. So that helps us out to determine that. So we have some examples where fixed production costs 100,000, variable production cost per unit is 80, right? And then during the summer season, we have a selling price of $125 and a salvage of $20. So we could compute for that. If the manufacturer produces 10,000 units, well then, and if the demand ends up at 12,000, then what happens is that unfortunately you only get to make profit on the 10,000. You've lost an opportunity for selling 2,000 swimsuits. All right, and you could compute what the profit is, $350,000 in this case. However, if the manufacturer produces the same 10,000 but the demand is 8,000, look at what happens. then you compute the profit. The profit is 140,000. So if you're off, if you produce less than your demand, yes, you lose some profit, but your profit is 350,000. But look at that, if you produce more than your demand, because you now have the additional cost of production that you incurred where you did not recoup that cost through sales, then it really impacts your profit. So these are some of the things that you need to compute to get a sense of, well, what should our optimum order quantity be if I have a sense of what a demand pattern is, and the costs associated with the various options: sales, manufacturing, and salvage. All right. So I will actually demonstrate, rather than going through the slide by slide here, I will demonstrate some of that in a separate video where I do some of the computation. But this is just showing us for different scenarios what the profit levels would be. So for example, if the demand was 8,000 units, then you could make a profit of 140,000 if an 11% probability. If the demand, excuse me, was say 12,000 units with a probability of 27%, then you could make a profit of 140,000 with 27% probability. So the total profit that you get is sort of the weighted average of all of those profit scenarios, which I showed you in that formula earlier. And if you were to draw it as a graph, you could find the optimum point right here, which is the point that maximizes your profit, because this is really your graphing of your expected profit based on the order quantity, right? And so then it seems like in this particular scenario, the best decision is to order 12,000 units, right? What's the relationship between the optimum order quantity and your average demand? Well, first of all, let's just make sure we understand what average demand is. The average demand is really, if you take each of the demand scenarios and you weight them by the probabilities, that will give you the average demand. So if you look at the marginal profit per unit, selling price minus the variable or ordering cost, right? And then your marginal costs, which is your ordering costs or your variable ordering costs or production costs minus the salvage value. So what happens now is if your marginal profit is greater than your marginal cost, then you want to keep as much inventory as possible. In other words, you want to order quantities that are larger than your average demand, because there's a chance that if you sell more than the average, you will recoup that because your marginal profit is greater than your marginal cost. But if your marginal cost is actually higher, which is down here, you see marginal cost is greater than marginal profit, then your quantity should be less than your average demand. And of course, if your marginal cost is equal to your marginal profit, then the optimum decision is really the average demand. All right, and that could be shown rather easily. So we have an example already given to us here that I will go over in a separate video where you could actually see the calculations. All right. There are cases where you want to look at the risk of making decisions around the quantities, and this is an interesting concept, which is if you look at the particular graph that we have, there are some points where the expected, let me just go back to the diagram and you will see that. For example, if I were to draw a straight line across here, then there is a decision that will yield an expected profit of 300,000. If I go down, it's probably somewhere around 9,000 units or something. But if I continue across here, then there is some sort of 16,000 units or somewhere around that would yield about the same profit. So the question is, which should you make? Should you make the 9,000, or should you order the 9,000 units, or should you order the 16,000 units, even though the expected profit is the same? But what are some of the risks associated with those? And this is what this section talks about in this case right here. That what you should do is you could take each decision and then look at what happens to the revenues. And you could see that if you decide to produce or order 9,000 units in this case, so 9 and 16,000, then you don't have any situation where you end up in a loss. All right? But you could see that your opportunity for profits is really only at 2 points right here. But if you made 16, if you actually looked at 16,000 units, you see here where you have scenarios where you actually could be losing money, and then eventually you start to make money. When you average those out, you end up with the same average profit, but as you could see, you have some greater risk associated with that here on this side. What's interesting is that notice that the largest amount of profit that you could make with an order of 9,000 units is really that $300,000 right here. But look at that, there is that possibility that you could make over $500,000 with a profit if you ordered 16,000 units. That's tricky. But there's, that's reward, but there's risk associated with that. This case, here's your reward, but not much risk. So you got to balance that. It depends on what kind of decision maker that you actually are in this case. So increasing the order quantities increases your risk, but also increases your potential returns as well. All right. So it depends on if you're a gambler, you might very well consider doing something like this. So we have some observations. The optimal order quantity is not necessarily equal to the forecast or the average demand. As the order quantity increases, average profit typically increases until the production quantity reaches a certain point and you get diminishing marginal returns. Risk-reward trade-off: as we increase the production quantity, both risk and reward increases as well. All right. So we will, let's just take a pause at this stage right here and then come back and talk a bit about initial inventory and what that does in a case like that.